The stallion's hooves pounded against the hard, packed earth as Madeline Lawson fled her family's Montana homestead, the rising sun stretching her shadow long across the open prairie. Tears streaked her dust-covered face, but she refused to look back at the life she was leaving behind. The shame that had driven her away burned hotter than the summer sun beating down on her shoulders. It was 1878, and at 22, Madeline had committed what her father called an unforgivable sin. She had fallen in love with the wrong man, a drifter who had promised her the world, only to disappear when she needed him most. The whispers in church, the disappointed looks from her parents, and the malicious gossip spreading through their small farming community had become unbearable. Her reputation was in tatters, and her father had made it clear she had brought dishonor to the Lawson name, so before dawn she had packed what little she could carry, taken her mother's locket and her father's spare pistol, and slipped away on her chestnut mare, Penny. She had no destination in mind, just away from the judgment and the crushing weight of her family's disappointment. Madeline had been riding for hours when she heard the approaching hoofbeats. Fear gripped her heart as she urged Penny to go faster. She was a woman alone on the frontier, an easy target for outlaws, rustlers, or worse. "Hold up there, miss." A deep voice called from behind her. Madeline ignored the command, leaning forward in her saddle, her bonnet flying off and her auburn hair streaming behind her like a banner. "Miss Lawson." "Madeline, it's Daniel Jenkins." The name registered through her panic, and Madeline reluctantly pulled back on the reins. Daniel Jenkins was her neighbor's son, a cowboy who had spent the last few years working cattle drives between Montana and Texas. She'd known him since childhood, though they'd never been close. He had always been too quiet, too serious for her tastes. She brought Penny to a halt and turned to face him, her chest heaving with exertion and fear. Daniel's midnight black stallion trotted up alongside her, steam rising from its flanks in the cool morning air. "What do you want, Mr. Jenkins?" she asked, her voice brittle with exhaustion and wariness. Daniel Jenkins tipped his worn Stetson back, revealing eyes the color of a summer sky. His face was tanned and weathered from years under the open sun, but his expression was surprisingly gentle. "Your mother sent me after you," he said simply. "Found her crying by the barn at dawn. She knew where you'd gone." Shame washed over Madeline anew. "Well, you can go back and tell her I'm not coming home. There's nothing for me there anymore." Daniel studied her for a long moment, taking in her tear-stained face, the hasty way she'd packed her saddlebags, and the determined set of her jaw. "No more shame, Madeline," he said softly, his words carrying on the prairie wind. "Whatever happened, whatever you're running from, it doesn't define you." Madeline stared at him, startled by his words. "You don't know what I've done. I know you're Elizabeth and Thomas Lawson's daughter. I know you've got more backbone than most men I've ridden with, and I know running away won't solve anything." His voice held no judgment, only a quiet certainty that made something inside her still. "I can't go back," she whispered. "I'm not asking you to," Daniel replied, surprising her. "But I'm not letting you ride alone into unknown territory either. Where are you headed?" Madeline looked past him toward the distant mountains. "I thought maybe Helena. I could find work there." Daniel nodded. "Helena's a good 4 days' ride, dangerous country between here and there." He paused, his eyes meeting hers directly. "I'll ride with you." "Why would you do that?" Suspicion colored her tone. A small smile touched his lips. "Because your mother asked me to look after you, and because I've seen what happens to folks who ride alone out here." Something in his steady gaze made Madeline believe him. It wasn't pity she saw in his eyes, but respect, something she hadn't seen from anyone in months. "I don't need a keeper, Mr. Jenkins." "No, madam, you don't, but everyone needs a friend out here, even stubborn Lawsons." Despite herself, Madeline felt a small smile tug at her lips. "My father won't like it." "Your father isn't here," Daniel replied simply, "and I answer to my own conscience, not Thomas Lawson's." As the sun climbed higher in the Montana sky, Madeline Lawson made her decision. With a slight nod, she clicked her tongue at Penny and turned back toward the trail. Daniel fell in beside her, his presence somehow making the vast emptiness of the prairie feel less threatening. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the rhythm of their horses' hooves filling the silence. Madeline found herself stealing glances at her unexpected companion. Daniel Jenkins had grown into a man since she'd last really looked at him. His shoulders were broad beneath his worn denim jacket, his hands confident on the reins. There was a quiet strength about him that she'd never noticed before. When they stopped at a small creek to water the horses, Daniel handed Madeline a strip of jerky from his saddlebag. "Not as good as your mother's cooking, but it'll keep you going," he said. Madeline accepted it gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. "Thank you for this and for coming after me." Daniel nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "Your mother loves you, you know. Whatever happened between you and your father, she wanted me to tell you that." The words opened a fresh wound in Madeline's heart. "I know she does, but love wasn't enough to make her stand up to him." "Folks are complicated," Daniel replied, his voice thoughtful. "Marriage even more so. You sound like you speak from experience, Mr. Jenkins." A shadow crossed his face. "Just observation, and please call me Daniel. If we're going to be traveling together, we might as well dispense with formalities." Madeline nodded, finding comfort in the small gesture of familiarity. "Daniel, then." As they continued their journey, Madeline found herself opening up to Daniel in ways she never expected. Perhaps it was the vastness of the landscape that made her own troubles seem smaller, or perhaps it was Daniel's quiet, non-judgmental presence. By the time they made camp that first night, she had told him about James Blackstone, the handsome traveler who had swept into their community with grand tales of San Francisco and promises of a beautiful life together. How he had courted her in secret, knowing her father would never approve. How she had given him her heart, and more only to discover he had a wife waiting for him in California. "When I told him I was in trouble, he vanished the next day," Madeline said, staring into the small campfire Daniel had built. "Left me to face the consequences alone." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "And your father called me a harlot in front of the entire family," Madeline whispered, the pain still fresh. "Said no decent man would have me now. Said I'd brought shame to the Lawson name that could never be washed away." "That's not true," Daniel said firmly, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Your father is wrong, Madeline. One mistake doesn't define a life." "In his world it does," she replied bitterly. "And what about the child? What kind of life could I give a baby born in scandal?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Is there still a child?" Madeline shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I lost it 2 weeks ago. My mother told my father it was just a woman's monthly sickness, but we both knew." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Maybe it was God's mercy, but I grieved for it all the same." Without a word, Daniel moved to sit beside her, his solid presence a comfort in the gathering darkness. "I'm sorry, Madeline," he said simply, "for all of it. For what that man did to you, for what you lost, and for how your father treated you." His genuine compassion broke something loose inside her, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Madeline allowed herself to truly weep. Daniel's arm came around her shoulders, strong and steady as she cried for the future she had imagined, for the child she would never know, and for the family she was leaving behind. When her tears finally subsided, she felt emptied out but somehow lighter. Daniel handed her his bandana and moved back to his side of the fire, giving her space to compose herself. "Thank you," she said softly. "I haven't. I couldn't cry in front of them. My father said my tears were just manipulation." "Your father sounds like a man who's forgotten what it means to have a heart," Daniel replied, poking at the fire with a stick. "My pa was the same way, ruled our ranch with an iron fist, thought kindness was weakness." "Is that why you left?" Madeline asked, grateful to shift the focus away from her own pain. Daniel nodded. "Couldn't breathe under his thumb. Joined my first cattle drive when I was 17, been on the move ever since." He looked up at the star-filled sky. "Found more freedom out here than I ever had at home." I hope I can find that too, Madeline said, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders against the night chill. Daniel's eyes met hers across the fire. You will. You're stronger than you know, Madeline Lawson. As they settled in for the night, Madeline found herself wondering about the man lying a few feet away from her. Daniel Jenkins had always been in the background of her life, a quiet shadow compared to flashy men like James Blackstone. Yet here he was, risking his father's wrath to help her find her way. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Madeline woke to find Daniel already up, tending a small fire with coffee brewing. He had laid out a modest breakfast of hardtack and dried apples. You sleep all right? He asked, handing her a tin cup of strong black coffee. Better than I expected, she admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. The night on the hard ground should have been uncomfortable, but exhaustion had pulled her into a dreamless sleep. As they rode that day, the conversation flowed more easily between them. Daniel told her about his adventures on cattle drives, about the characters he'd met, and the places he'd seen. Madeline found herself laughing at his stories, the first real laughter she'd experienced in months. What will you do in Helena? Daniel asked as they stopped to rest the horses in the shade of a cottonwood grove. Madeline pulled her canteen from her saddlebag. Find work, I suppose. I can sew well enough to be a seamstress, or maybe find a position as a shop girl. Daniel nodded, but she could see concern in his eyes. It's not an easy place for a woman alone. I'm aware, Madeline replied, a touch of her old spirit flaring. But what choice do I have? I can't go home, and I won't become the kind of woman who sells herself for survival. There are other options, Daniel said carefully. My friend Robert owns a small ranch outside Helena. His wife just had their third child. They've been looking for someone to mind the children and assist with household duties. It would be respectable work with a roof over your head and good people around you. Madeline considered his words. You would vouch for me, even knowing my situation. Daniel's gaze was steady. Your situation, as you call it, doesn't change who you are, Madeline. You're a good woman who trusted the wrong man. That's all. His simple acceptance of her, flaws and all, touched something deep within Madeline's heart. For the first time since James Blackstone had betrayed her, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps her life wasn't ruined beyond repair. As they continued their journey, the landscape began to change, the open prairie giving way to rolling hills and scattered pine forests. They encountered few other travelers, but each night as they made camp, Madeline felt less afraid of what lay ahead. On the third night, a sudden spring storm forced them to seek shelter in an abandoned line shack. The small one-room structure was dusty but sound, with a stone fireplace and a single narrow cot. You take the cot, Daniel said as he worked to get a fire started. I'll be fine on the floor. Madeline watched him work, his strong hands efficiently arranging kindling. Why are you being so kind to me, Daniel? Truly, Daniel was quiet for a moment, focused on coaxing the small flame to life. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Because I've watched you grow up, Madeline. Seen you at church socials and town gatherings. You were always different from the other girls, smarter, braver, with dreams bigger than that little farming community. He sat back on his heels as the fire caught, casting warm light across the small space. And because I know what it's like to feel trapped by other people's expectations, to make mistakes and pay for them over and over. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face in stark relief. Madeline saw something in his expression she hadn't noticed before, a vulnerability beneath the quiet strength. What mistakes did you make? She asked softly. Daniel stared into the growing fire. I fell in love with the wrong person too. Eliza Thornton, daughter of my father's biggest rival. We met in secret for almost a year. A sad smile touched his lips. When our fathers found out, sent her back east to live with relatives. Mine beat me until I couldn't stand, then told me no son of his would ever bring such disgrace to the Jenkins name. Is that when you left for good? Daniel nodded. Joined a cattle drive the next day, never went back except to visit my mother when my father's away on business. He looked up at Madeline. So you see, I understand something about shame and family disappointment. Madeline moved to sit beside him, their shoulders almost touching. I'm sorry about Eliza. It was years ago, Daniel said, though she could hear the lingering hurt in his voice. Sometimes I wonder if I'd fought harder for her if things might have been different. Maybe that's why you came after me, Madeline suggested, a chance to right an old wrong. Daniel turned to look at her, the firelight dancing in his blue eyes. Maybe, or maybe it's because no one should have to face the wilderness alone. Thunder crashed overhead, making Madeline jump. Without thinking, she reached for Daniel's hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and reassuring. The storm will pass, he said quietly, though Madeline wasn't sure if he was talking about the weather or something more. They sat like that for a long time, hands entwined, watching the fire and listening to the rain pounding on the roof. For the first time in months, Madeline felt safe not just from the elements, but from the judgment and shame that had driven her from her home. When morning came, the storm had cleared, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling with raindrops. As they prepared to continue their journey, Madeline noticed a change in how Daniel looked at her, a warmth that hadn't been there before. We should reach Helena by nightfall, he said, as they mounted their horses. Are you still planning to speak with Robert and his wife about the position? Madeline nodded, surprised to feel a flutter of nervousness. Do you think they'll truly not care about my past? Robert married a former saloon singer against his family's wishes, Daniel replied with a smile. They're not the type to judge others. They rode side by side through the day, the miles passing in comfortable conversation. Madeline found herself watching Daniel when he wasn't looking the confident way he sat his horse, the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to her, the strength in his hands. She was seeing him with new eyes, this man who had ridden after her not out of obligation or pity, but out of understanding. As the sun began to set, the buildings of Helena came into view in the distance. Madeline reined in Penny, suddenly hesitant. What if I'm making another mistake? She asked, voicing the fear that had been growing throughout the day. What if I'm just running from one problem into another? Daniel guided his horse closer to hers. That's the risk of living, Madeline. None of us can see what's ahead. All we can do is make the best choice we can with what we know now. And if it's wrong, then we adjust course and keep moving forward, he said simply. That's all any of us can do. His quiet confidence steadied her. With a deep breath, Madeline nudged Penny forward, toward the future that awaited her in Helena. Robert and Sarah Miller's ranch was smaller than the Lawson farm, but it had a warmth that Madeline noticed immediately. Lamplight glowed in the windows of the modest house, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from inside. Daniel had sent word ahead with a passing rider they'd encountered that morning, so the Millers were expecting them. Sarah Miller, a petite woman with kind eyes and a musical voice that hinted at her past, welcomed them at the door with a sleeping baby in her arms. Daniel Jenkins, as I live and breathe, she said, her face lighting up. Robert said you'd be coming, and you must be Madeline. Her warm welcome eased some of Madeline's anxiety. Robert Miller proved to be as kind as his wife, showing them to the table where a hot meal awaited. Over supper, with the Miller children chattering excitedly about having visitors, Madeline found herself relaxing. These people didn't know her past, didn't see her through the lens of scandal and shame. To them, she was simply a young woman looking for a fresh start. After the children were tucked into bed, Sarah showed Madeline to a small but comfortable room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's private, she said. The children can be a handful, but they're good-hearted. If you decide to stay, I think you'll be happy here. Thank you for the opportunity, Madeline said sincerely. Daniel speaks very highly of you and your husband. Sarah smiled, her eyes twinkling. Daniel's a good man, best I've known next to Robert. She paused, studying Madeline thoughtfully. He's never brought a woman to meet us before, not in all the years we've known him. Before Madeline could process what Sarah might be implying, the older woman wished her good night and slipped away. Leaving Madeline alone with her thoughts, from her window, she could see Daniel in the yard. talking with Robert under the stars. He looked relaxed, at home in a way she'd never seen during their journey. Helena could be a good place for her too, she realized. A place to heal, to rebuild, to become someone new. The next morning, Madeline agreed to stay with the Millers, at least temporarily. Daniel helped her unpack her meager belongings, his presence a comfort as she took this first step into her new life. "I should be moving on," he said as they stood outside the Miller home later that day. "Got some business in Virginia City I've been putting off." Madeline felt an unexpected pang at his words. In just 4 days, Daniel Jenkins had become important to her in ways she couldn't fully explain. "Will you come back through Helena?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Something flickered in Daniel's eyes. "Would you want me to?" Madeline found she couldn't lie to him. "Yes, very much." Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. "Then I'll come back, in a month's time when my business is concluded." "A month," Madeline echoed, surprised by how long it seemed. Daniel reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, and tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Will you be all right until then?" Madeline nodded, leaning slightly into his touch. "I'll be fine. The Millers are good people, just as you said. And when I return." Daniel asked, his voice low. "What then, Madeline?" She took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of something important. "When you return, perhaps we could discover what this is between us, without the shadows of the past hanging over us." A slow smile spread across Daniel's face, transforming his serious features. "I'd like that very much." When he leaned down to kiss her, it was gentle, a promise rather than a demand. Nothing like James Blackstone's passionate but ultimately hollow embraces. Daniel's kiss held something more substantial: respect, understanding, and the seedling of something that could grow into love. As she watched him ride away, Madeline felt not loss, but anticipation. For the first time in months, she was looking forward rather than back. The month passed more quickly than Madeline expected. She settled into life with the Miller family, caring for the children during the day and helping Sarah with household tasks. The work was demanding but satisfying, and the Millers treated her with respect and kindness. Sarah, who had faced her own share of judgment for her past as a saloon singer, became a confidante. One evening, as they sat mending clothes after the children were asleep, Madeline found herself sharing the whole story of James Blackstone and her father's rejection. "People are quick to condemn what they don't understand," Sarah said when Madeline had finished, "especially when it comes to women and their choices." "My father believed he was upholding God's law," Madeline said, though the defense sounded hollow even to her own ears. Sarah's needle flashed in the lamplight. "My father was a preacher, did you know that? He taught me that God's greatest commandment was to love one another, not to judge, not to condemn, to love." She looked up at Madeline with compassionate eyes. "Your father forgot that part." Those words stayed with Madeline, helping her to see her past in a new light. The shame that had driven her from home began to lose its power over her, and always, in quiet moments, her thoughts turned to Daniel. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he thought of her as often as she thought of him. The day Daniel was due to return, Madeline found herself watching the road anxiously. When a rider appeared in the distance, her heart leapt, only to fall when she realized it wasn't him. By sunset, with no sign of Daniel, worry began to gnaw at her. Had he changed his mind? Had something happened to him on the dangerous roads? She was helping Sarah put the children to bed when they heard hoofbeats in the yard. Madeline's hands trembled as she smoothed the blanket over little Emma Miller. "Go," Sarah said with a knowing smile. "I'll finish here." Daniel was dismounting when Madeline stepped onto the porch. He looked tired and dusty from the trail, but his face lit up when he saw her. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, crossing to the porch in long strides. "Got delayed in Virginia City." "You're here now," Madeline replied, unable to stop the smile spreading across her face. "That's what matters." That night, after a late supper with the Millers, Daniel and Madeline walked under the stars, their hands finding each other naturally. "How was your month?" Daniel asked. "Are you settling in well?" Madeline nodded. "Better than I expected." "The children are wonderful, and Sarah and Robert have been so kind." She glanced up at him. "How was your business in Virginia City?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "It was illuminating. That's actually something I wanted to talk to you about." They stopped walking, and Daniel turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I went to Virginia City because I heard rumors that James Blackstone was there." Madeline's breath caught. "You went looking for him? Why?" "Because I wanted to understand the man who hurt you," Daniel said simply. "And because I needed to be sure he wouldn't come back into your life." "Did you find him?" Madeline asked, surprised by how steady her voice was. The name that had once held such power over her emotions now seemed distant, like a character from a story she'd once read. Daniel nodded. "He's working as a clerk in a dry goods store. Seems the grand adventures he boasted about were mostly fiction." He hesitated. "He's not married, Madeline. That was a lie, too." The revelation should have angered her, but instead Madeline felt only a profound relief. "It doesn't matter anymore. He's part of a past I'm leaving behind." Daniel studied her face in the moonlight. "You've changed since that first day on the prairie." "For the better, I hope," she said with a small smile. "Definitely for the better," Daniel affirmed. "You're standing taller, your eyes are clearer. You're becoming the woman you were always meant to be without shame or fear holding you back." His words touched her deeply. "And you've been part of that change, Daniel. You showed me kindness when I needed it most. You saw me the real me when I couldn't see myself anymore." Daniel's hands tightened around hers. "I have something else to tell you. I've purchased land about 10 miles from here. Good grazing land with a creek running through it and a small cabin that needs some work but is sound." Madeline's heart quickened. "You're staying in Montana." "I'm tired of drifting," Daniel admitted. "Ready to build something of my own, a home, a future." His blue eyes held hers intently. "I'd like you to be part of that future, Madeline, if you want to be. Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Madeline whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Daniel smiled, a touch of nervousness in his expression. "I'm not James Blackstone. I don't have fancy words or grand promises. All I can offer is my heart and my hands to work alongside you, to build a life together, to face whatever comes our way as partners." He took a deep breath. "I think I started falling in love with you that first day when you looked at me with tears on your face but fire in your eyes. I've never known anyone as brave as you, Madeline Lawson." Tears welled in Madeline's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I think I started falling in love with you when you said no more shame, when you looked at me and saw not what I'd done, but who I could be." Daniel's smile was radiant as he pulled her close. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Madeline whispered against his lips. 1,000 times yes." Their kiss beneath the Montana stars sealed a promise not just of marriage, but of a partnership built on understanding, respect, and the courage to leave the past behind. 2 months later, they were married in the small church in Helena, with the Millers and a few friends in attendance. Madeline wore a simple blue dress that matched Daniel's eyes and carried wildflowers gathered from the prairie. As they exchanged vows, Madeline thought of how far she had come from that desperate morning when she fled her family's farm. The shame that had once defined her had transformed into strength, and the pain of betrayal had given way to the joy of true partnership. That night, as they drove the wagon to their cabin, their home, Daniel looked over at his bride with wonder in his eyes. "Happy?" he asked simply. Madeline leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky. "More than I ever thought possible. The road ahead would not always be easy. Building a ranch from scratch would require hard work and perseverance. There would be difficult winters, uncertain markets, and the everyday challenges of frontier life." But as the cabin came into view, lamplight glowing in the window where Robert Miller had lit a fire to welcome them home, Madeline knew they would face it all together. No more running. No more shame. Just two people who had found in each other the courage to begin again, under the endless sky of the American West. Years later, when their children asked how they met, Daniel would wink at Madeline and say, "I chased your mother halfway across Montana just to tell her she had nothing to be ashamed of." And Madeline would smile, remembering that moment when a quiet cowboy had ridden beside her and changed the course of her life with 5 simple words. No more shame, Madeline Lawson. It had been the truth then, and it remained the truth through all the years that followed, a foundation strong enough to build a life upon, and a love that had transformed 2 wounded hearts into a family that flourished on the Montana frontier.